Hello, everyone, and a very warm welcome to this PEX Network webinar. I'm Michael Hill. I'm the editor of PEX Network. I'm really excited to be moderating this session where we're going to be looking at preventing financial and reputational risk with process intelligence. So really timely and important topic as well. So really excited to dive into this one. Just before we get started then, I'll just run through a quick few pieces of housekeeping. We're going to have a couple of poll questions in the session today, so I'll read those out for you. They're multiple choice, no right or wrong answers, but we're obviously very keen to get your input and your thoughts on those. So please do vote on those, and we'll be taking time to assess the results of those questions during the session. You can also submit any questions that you've got for our speaker today using the Q&A button on your screen. Again, that will be open throughout the session, so do feel free to submit questions anytime, and we'll be sure to save the time that we need to answer any questions that you do have. And you can also use the live chat function to share any thoughts or comments that you have. You can just let us know where you're viewing from and what you hope to get out of the session, and you can interact with your peers on there as well. So please do feel free to make use of that function. Okay, so delighted to introduce our speaker for today. So Max, I'll ask you to give a quick introduction of yourself and your background.
Absolutely. And Michael, I just wanted to thank you and PEX Network again so much for having us. Always love doing these webinars and engaging with the audience and understanding what challenges they're having and how we can help solve for them. So like Michael said, my name is Max Smith. I'm and you know what, actually, we can probably start sharing the slides here, right?
Yeah, sure.
Just give me 1 second to bring that up. All right. Can you just confirm you can see it?
Looks good to me, Max.
Spot on. Let's go. Okay, so like Michael said, my name is Max Smith. I'm a senior director of product marketing here at iGrafx. I've spent over a decade helping build, design, and bring software products to market. I really have a passion for market research. Like, I love engaging with audience members like yourselves, like customers in the market, seeing what's going on. I love technology, love hearing about new technology that's out, what people's take on it is. And ultimately, I love connecting the dots. So I work for a software company, and I really enjoy trying to help our customers understand more directly what value we can drive with the software that we provide. So I think that's enough about me. We can jump right into the presentation. And so this is a webinar about risk and compliance, right? So I think it's best if we start with the challenge and understand why are we even here? Why are we even talking about this? And I think over the last couple of years and even currently, there's been a heightened regulatory environment, and it doesn't really matter what industry you're in. There's various regulations, whether you're in manufacturing, you're dealing with OSHA, whether you're a bank and you're dealing with SOX or healthcare and HIPAA. There's all these different types of regulations, and there's more regulations that are coming out. The ones that are currently being drafted but aren't in effect, and then the ones you don't even know about yet, right? So it's this constantly evolving spectrum of regulation that's expensive. It consumes your time. It keeps you, as I'm assuming, risk and compliance professionals on the webinar, it probably keeps you up at night, right? And the consequences of not reacting to this are colossal. So for example, last year in 2023, the SEC filed 784 enforcement actions, with about nearly $5 billion in penalties. And importantly, we're talking about like one agency here for one industry in one country. Obviously, if you're a global business on the call like this, the exposure is massive, right? So what do we do about this? Or what would the best case scenario look like in handling these changes in the regulatory and compliance environment? So I just want to kind of paint a picture of the art of the possible. And if we look on the left here, we're really trying to change this notion of we've defined risk and controls, like we have some sort of plan, because that's good. That's obviously the first step. You need to have an R&C program in place, but you want to be able to prove it, because ultimately when you get audited externally, first you'll have your internal audit teams doing the auditing, but ultimately if you face an external audit, you need to be able to prove that your controls are effective, and that you're adequately managing the risk. So that proof, getting better visibility, getting better transparency, and getting better documentation about what's actually happening in your business can help a lot as you're facing these new regulations that are coming out. And so within that art of the possible organization, right, as we're moving towards this goal, there's a couple characteristics that I would say are important. The first is that you want harmony between the three lines of defense. So in talking to a lot of risk and compliance professionals, this is part of the challenge that they have in their day-to-day, where the business units aren't fully aligned with the risk and compliance teams and fully aligned with the internal audit teams. And so all those teams need to be speaking the same language, because ultimately everyone in the company is a risk manager, right? It's not just the risk team. So if not everyone's on the same page, then you're not going to have meaningful results. And piggybacking on that, and specifically for the risk and compliance teams, I would say one of the things I hear often is that they wish that the business units took more ownership of their risk, because at the end of the day, they're the people that are executing the business processes. They're the ones that are either engaging in risky behavior or preventing risky behavior with their actions, right? And so in this art of the possible organization, they have ownership of their risk. They're informed about it. They know what the risks are, and then they act appropriately. I spoke about audit a second ago, and I know audit can be a massive undertaking, both if you're undergoing an internal audit, but particularly if you're undergoing an external audit. And so you want the proof of the effectiveness of your program to be easy. You want it to be fast. You want to be able to get all the information you need. And probably most importantly, you want it to be accurate and not based on opinions of internal personnel. And then lastly, in this perfect organization, you're resilient operationally. So as these new regulations come out that might change the way that you do business or might change the way in which you can go to market, you want to be able to understand what is the impact of that regulation, how's it going to affect me, and what can I do about it? So that's kind of the perfect organization. And obviously the title of the webinar is preventing financial and reputational risk with process intelligence. So let's take a second to talk about how process intelligence can help you get there. But before we do that, we need to have a more grounded understanding of what process intelligence is. And I really look at it from two different viewpoints. The first is conceptually, as the name would suggest. It's everything you need to understand the who, what, when, why, where, how of your processes. So understanding how they're operating in reality, how the business is doing their job, because with that understanding, you can better understand the risks that exist and how you might want to mitigate them. If we look at it from a technology perspective, because process intelligence is a technology category, it's really a combination of a number of other technologies that you might already be familiar with, things like data analytics tools, process or task mining, process modeling. You might have heard of that referred to as EBPA, BPM, business process management, simulation and automation. So it's really bringing together all these disparate technologies to give you a more grounded understanding of the business and also help you execute in a more risk-informed and risk-compliant way. And when you bring these different technologies together, you really get this exponential return. These tools work better together. So you could deploy each of these for a specific purpose. Like you could automate a part of maybe like a KYC onboarding process where you're automating some sort of check, or you could do an analysis of your customer onboarding process. But really bringing all of these together produces exponential returns because you're taking action directly based on the data. It's this tight chain of causality across the organization. Using process intelligence also helps enable the shift from as is to the to be. So with some of the technologies that I mentioned, they help you understand exactly how the business is operating, but you can also design what does gold standard look like for me? What does the future state of this process with the regulation and these various risks in mind? What does that look like? And so using process intelligence, you can help on that journey. And as I'm sure you've all experienced, right? It's not a fixed starting and end point. It's continuous. It's continuous process improvement and continuous risk management. But at those different discrete points where you have a goal that you're working towards, process intelligence can help you get there. And then lastly, it really helps making the complex simple through that visibility, through that transparency, through this convergence of shared perspectives between the business, between the executives, between the risk and compliance team, and all of the different players in the organization that you care about from a risk perspective. And so that's a bit about what it was. How does it actually work? So we look at process improvement generally in 3 phases: discover, design, and optimize. This is true if you're trying to improve the business for performance, like you're trying to improve productivity or reduce costs. but it's equally as true if you're trying to improve the business from a risk mitigation standpoint. And so in the discovery phase, we use technology like process mining to help you get objective visibility. It basically extracts data directly from your systems. So rather than asking people and getting a subjective opinion as to how a process is operating, you can get concrete, objective visibility into what's actually happening, identify unmitigated risks, maybe risks that don't have mitigating controls yet, or risks that your team was unaware of. So you can get that objective picture of what's happening. Once you know what the challenges are in the processes, then you can design the future state process. And again, importantly, this is in regards to both the external regulations that we've been talking about, as well as the internal policies of the organization, which in some cases are equally as important. And importantly, in this step, you're building that ideal future state, that risk-informed future state, collaboratively. So I talked about how in this ideal world, we have the 3 lines of defense that are working together in perfect harmony. You have the business that's taking ownership of their risk. This happens through this collaboration when you're talking about the process in the same way and everyone understands the risks with the process in the same way. And so collaboration is really important here. And then lastly, you want to quantify future process performance, both from like a business performance standpoint, as well as a risk performance standpoint, based on any changes that you're making when you're reacting to this regulation. And you can do that through things like process simulation. We'll talk about that a little bit more when we have the discussion in just a second here. And then lastly, as you're optimizing the process, you're making the changes, and those can be people, process, or technology changes as you're rolling them out. This is a continuous cycle. So you need to be doing this continuously, going through this constant cycle of continuous improvement, but you also want to be monitoring what's going on because that'll safeguard you against future risks. So as you're deploying a solution or as you're changing your process to react to a policy or to react to a regulation, you want to make sure that that rollout's going smoothly and that nothing unexpected is happening in regards to that rollout. But you also want to make sure that nothing else is going on in the process that would expose your company to more risk at the same time. For instance, maybe you're in the middle of you're changing a process up because of regulation that's coming out, and we're in the period of the Great Resignation. And so you know that you need compliance personnel to help execute this process that you're putting together. But if you don't have the talent to actually execute, like this is now also like a very meaningful risk, right? And so you want to be able to continuously monitor your processes and have a pulse on what's going on. So that's all I have for the intro. Michael and I are going to have a discussion now, talk a bit about some of the characteristics of process intelligence and how it can more effectively help you with your risk program. But I believe, Michael, we have a poll first before we jump in, right?
Yeah, we do. Thanks for that presentation, Max. Really great, and a big thank you, obviously, to the audience who've already submitted a couple of questions. So we'll have a look at those in just a few minutes. But yes, I will look to open the voting on the first poll question now. So that is, what is your biggest risk and compliance challenge? So you've got a number of options. So I'm going to launch that one now, so it's live. I'm going to leave that running for the next several minutes, so please do vote on there. You see you've got a number of options to choose from. We've also included other there. If you do want to select other, do feel free to use the instant chat service to tell us what that other is, and we'll keep an eye on that to see what answers come in. It'll be really interesting to see what else you're facing other than the most common answers that we've included there. So we'll come back to that shortly. Okay, so Max, obviously a great presentation, and I think you've set the scene really well. My first question for you then is, in your experience, working with customers, do you think enough organizations right now are applying process intelligence to tackle their risk and compliance challenges? Obviously organizations, it's high up on the agenda. Do you think process intelligence specifically is being applied as much as it should be?
I would say that it's almost 50-50 for me. I would say that process intelligence in its full form. So I discussed that there's like kind of multiple sub technologies that are included there, right? And these work better together. The amount of customers that I've seen that have matured to the point where they're using all of these technologies in conjunction and really driving at what the true capability of process intelligence is low. I think that there's room to grow here. There's still room for maturity. That being said, I don't think it's I don't want to be a naysayer or a total pessimist either. I have seen a lot of phenomenal compliance programs, and I have seen different compliance officers and compliance personnel using pieces of the technology, pieces of process intelligence to accomplish specific goals, and they've been particularly effective there. I've seen customers that have used process mining, and the first time that they see a process in a way that they haven't seen before, that came directly from the data, and they say, wait a second, what's happening there? Like, I've never seen this, or like, hey, we're missing a step. Why are we going, why is the process circumventing this approval step? And specifically, and there's multiple different violations. Like, they're looking at things like, what's the cycle time of our process? Are we violating SLAs that we might be obligated statutorily to get back to a customer at a certain time? Whether that's, there's rules for GDPR and the right to be forgotten, and how quickly you have to respond. There's rules for if you're in insurance, how quickly you have to get back to a claim or address it, or if they appeal a claim, how quickly you need to get back to them. So you can look at things like SLAs. You can look at things like segregation of duties violations. So within a process is the same person that's actually taking the action, the person that's also approving it. That's a big no-no in the risk and compliance world. And so I would say, like, I've seen plenty of customers use process mining for risk and compliance individually and get a lot of insight and a lot of value out of it. I've seen a lot of customers that have this, they are working to be more tightly connected with the lines of business, that first line of defense. And so those first lines of defense, they're using process modeling already to document their processes for their, for instance, their standard operating procedures. And so they're already there. They're already viewing those models, or they're already thinking in terms of those models. And so I've seen risk and compliance teams very effectively bring all of the risks and control information, to the place where they're already at. And I've seen like a lot of synergy there, and a lot of benefit to the risk and compliance team. Like, they have to do less effort to train the organization on what the exposure is.
Yeah. Great stuff. Thanks, Matt. Really great answer. Good to hear that that's the case right now, and that's what you're seeing. Okay, another question I've got for you then, and this is something you touched on in your presentation, so we'll dive into it a bit further quickly, is this idea of process simulation. And I guess, if we're looking at automation, how does process intelligence help businesses automatically produce the evidence that they need of compliance for regulations and rules?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think that there's actually there's two questions here. Or I see it as two questions. So I'll break it one and one. Let's start with the first one in my mind was about simulation. So let's come to that in a second. But the second one was about the proof of compliance, right? Like, how do you show what you've done? Because unfortunately, in the reality that we all live in, it really doesn't matter if you're doing a good job in the risk and compliance team. It matters if you can prove to people, whether that's your internal auditors or external auditors, that you're doing the job that you can say you can do, right? And so I actually have a slide for this that I'm happy to bring back up. Let me just, yep, there we go. Okay, so there's two ways specifically from a technology standpoint that stick out to me for this. The first one is just simply the documentation and the reporting on risks. So a lot of companies that I've seen, particularly as they're maturing, they invest in GRC systems. And so they capture their risk program largely through that technology. But in particular, like the risk and control catalogs that exist in those systems, we've seen people bring that information into the process intelligence tools to, again, help contextualize those risk and controls with how the business is already looking at their processes. And so in bringing that in, you can document what the program looks like, but you can also show from a process specific lens where those risks and gaps exist. So you can do that from a communication standpoint in terms of if an auditor is asking, okay, like, where are these risk and controls being applied? you have a much better answer. You have a more visually appealing answer because you can see them directly on the processes. But it's also just more contextual. Like what is the impact of this control, or what is the impact on this risk in terms of business performance metrics, not only KRIs, but KPIs as well, right? And then when you're actually undergoing the audit, one of the most powerful parts of process intelligence is this notion of conformance checking. I did a webinar about this with PEX Network not too long ago, actually, but that was more for performance purposes, right? From a risk standpoint, what you can do is you can say, okay, here's how we drew up the process. Here's what the ideal process looks like that complies with the regulations, that has all these mitigating controls in place. And then you can use process mining and say, okay, this is what it looks like today. This is how it's actually executing based on the data that we see in the systems. And so you can do a comparison between those two. And if you look on the GIF that's playing on the right side, I'm not sure if it actually stopped for everyone or not, but there was a GIF playing on the right side. Regardless, the idea is we can see a process model in the background. And then this black path that's showing on top of it is one of the variants of process execution that we see in reality. And so you can do this comparison and say, are there steps that are being taken that aren't in the process, right? Is there something that's happening that we weren't aware of originally? But you can also say, is the process being followed? Are these steps happening? Are we missing steps? Are we taking paths that are skipping certain checks that shouldn't be there? It's probably hard to see for the audience, but this is actually a customer onboarding process that has the KYC portion displayed. And so when you're doing things like checking exclusion lists or doing a PEP screening or whatever it is, right, you need to make sure that those steps happen in the process, right? And so that conformance checking is a really good way to, before the auditors come, figure out, are we operating in a compliant fashion? And after they come, here is proof. Here is data-driven proof that our controls are effective, because we can see that the way that the business is executing their processes is in line with our risk and control program. So that was the question about the audit and being able to prove it. And then you would also, could you just remind me, sorry, what did you ask about simulation?
I wonder whether process simulation comes into that, or whether that's something separate, or is it related?
It's all a bit related, right? I said that that process intelligence is better together, right, than using the technology separately. So I do have one more slide, and I think this is the last slide I have to show, which is on the left side, you can see process mining. On the right side, you can see process simulation. And so how simulation comes into this is, as your process is changing. So I spoke to a customer in France. They were passing legislation that all financial transactions had to be reported to a central repository that they were building that was held. It was a government repository, right? Because they were trying to do some large scale AML and fraud type analysis by looking at transactions across the entire financial system. And so that step involved a new reporting action basically in their transactional process. And so they wanted to know, okay, if we add this step, whose job is this going to be? Who's going to take care of it? How much time is it going to take? Can it be automated? And they had all these questions about not only the exposure to them for non-compliance and could they meaningfully handle this requirement with the resources that they had, but also from a performance perspective, they were interested in understanding, is this going to negatively impact the business? Is it going to slow down this process in a way that's going to sour customer expectations or damage our reputation? Or is the cost of this process now going to and for this particular example, the answer was largely no, right? Because it wasn't that big of an addition. But they were able to prove that, right? Because they used simulation and they said, okay, with this step in, if we assume we need one resource or one person or one bot to do this, and here's the different costs for those options, this is how much the process costs today. This is how much it'll cost tomorrow. This is how fast the process is today. This is how fast it's going to be tomorrow. And so they could make that decision with confidence. And when they're approaching the business teams and, we're like, okay, we have to do this, right? Nobody wants to do this, but we have to do this. they could give the business confidence that, hey, this really isn't going to disrupt your your day-to-day as much as it might seem on the surface. And so it's as part of that audit, there's a sense of you have to effectively challenge the programs that are being put in place. And so simulation can help prove, it can help you react to regulation generally, but specifically for an audit, it can help you say, yes, we did consider this, or we considered doing it this way, and this is what the result would have been, and this is why it was or wasn't tenable for us, or was or wasn't a good decision. You can also, for things like if you have critical services. I was actually just at a risk conference the last 2 days, and this was a topic that they had brought up that I found interesting, where when you're looking at your providers, in some cases, and particularly if you're a financial institution, there is only one provider for a service. But so it's somewhat critical, and the contingency planning around that is quite a bit different than, for instance, if you have backups or you can use another vendor for a service, or it's just a bit different. But if you think about, non-financial institutions, it's the same thought process, right? If you use a service provider and that service provider goes down, or that service provider gets engaged in, and sorry, I'm jumping around a little bit, but I'm thinking of all these stories that I've heard. So we had one customer who they manufactured medical devices, and they were getting their tubing out of Russia. And obviously, Russia invades Ukraine, there's sanctions, they basically, they weren't able to get their tubing from Russia anymore. Not only were they not able, but they didn't want to, right? They were like, okay, we're not going to get our tubing here anymore. But they were able to use simulation to say, okay, with these different providers that we can get this from, in different parts of the globe, what does that look like? Like, what does that look like from a cost basis for new pricing with new vendors? What does that look for the logistics basis? If it's coming from Africa or North America, and you have to ship it, like how long does it take? Is this going to meaningfully be a detriment to our operations? Like, what kind of operational risk does this provide? And so simulation is a part of all of that. And for audit specifically, part of proving that you thought about different possibilities.
Yeah. Great stuff. Really interesting points made there, Max. Thanks for sharing those. Okay, what I'm going to do is I'm going to give a last few minutes for the first poll question before we take a look at that. But we had a question come in earlier from Sally, Max. I'll have a look at this one because it is interesting. She's asked, is there a training tool or a user tool you would recommend for sales and operations teams to understand risk, which won't make them feel like we are the sales preventive team? And this is particularly before we are in a signed contract and onboarding the customer. That's a really good question. Do you have any thoughts on that one?
Yeah, so there's the range of how you can tackle this question, or not the range. There are many facets to answering this question to be effective, I would say. And part of them is outside like the scope of the immediate conversation around process intelligence. There's obviously a cultural aspect to this. And there's a question around, how do you create your committees? Who's on those committees? How frequently do you meet? Do you have a good relationship with the business where both parties feel like they're being heard and their concerns are being addressed? And so I think that there's like a cultural element that companies, as they mature, they grow towards, and they try to bring each other in earlier on. So instead of being at a point where you're forced to react, it can be thought about together. So that's easier said than done. And there's millions of books on people management and strategies to bring people together culturally. But then from a technology perspective, yes, I think that this is what I was getting at earlier. So a lot of those customers in sales have some form of standard operating procedure. Like this is how we're supposed to engage with our customers, that sales leadership is passing down to them. You want to reach out to them this many times in this many formats in this time frame, and you want to make sure that you're checking to make sure that this part of the contract is aligned by this point in the sales cycle. And so all of those procedures are documented in some shape or fashion, and the sales team is already going there. So in that process intelligence tool that houses these operating procedures, right, you can see, for instance, on this step, for this particular contact with a customer, well, if you're reaching out to them and they're in Europe, maybe you have this reservation, if you're in North America, maybe that reservation doesn't apply. So you have the requirements right there around what you can and can't do statutorily. And so just from a communication standpoint, which I think was the first part of the question being asked, like that's super important. And I think one of the considerations is, if you want to be a good partner and extend an olive branch, don't say that we're creating the risks and controls here and you need to come to us and learn how we think about the world in order to understand how you should do your job. Bring it to them in their world and where they're already engaging, right? So bring that information to where they're already doing business and running their day-to-day. And I think process intelligence and some system integration can really help with that. But the second point is what I just covered about simulation. If you're going to the business and saying, hey, we need to take this into consideration, we need to change up our process to make sure that we're compliant, it's a much stronger presentation to them if you can say, hey, we've already tested what the impact of this looks like, and it's not actually that big, right? It might make the process take like marginally or trivially more time, but really it's not meaningful in the grand scheme of things. Or maybe you simulated it and it is going to cause a big impact, but at least then you can go to the business and say, look, like we need to do this. We're statutorily obligated to make whatever change we're making. Here's what we think the impact is going to be. And obviously that's not tenable for you in the business, but like we wanted to get ahead of this. We're not just going to say you have to do this and let you handle this on your own and figure out how you're going to make this work for you. Like, let's come together beforehand, like long beforehand, and figure out how we're going to tackle this together. So I think the technology can really help that conversation, but I'm not going to lie and say it's only a technology problem. There's also a cultural element that involves pieces outside the scope of process intelligence.
Yeah, no, great point. Thanks, Max. And hopefully that answers the question that we had there. Okay, let's look at the first poll question then. So I'm going to close that one off now. I'm going to share the results. You should be able to see them, but I'll read them out for you anyway. Thank you to everyone who took part. Looks like most of you did, which was great. So we asked, what is your biggest risk and compliance challenge? So top answer, 34% was documenting risks and controls systematically. That was followed by 31%, so very close behind us, understanding the impact of new regulation on the business. Third top answer, 29%, so very close together here, is aligning the organization around risks to share ownership. And then just 6% on proving compliance to auditors. Nobody selected other, so we obviously did a great job at listing what we think are the most common risks. So Max, the top answer there, which is documenting risks and controls. Are you surprised by that? Is that what you would expect to see as the biggest challenge that organizations face right now?
I think it varies from organization to organization. I actually don't think, I'm a little bit surprised that this is the most popular one. Although in fairness, there's really like a three-way split here for the most popular, we're just a couple percentage points off. And actually I want to make a note about the outlier here, which is the audit one. That's really interesting to me, honestly. But I think it means that the audience members, there's not many people from audit teams here. It's mostly second line. And so, the auditing is not, it is their problem, but it's not their problem, right? So for the other three, yeah, I am a little bit surprised about the documenting risk and controls systemically, because I feel like whether and maybe it's just a matter of specificity, right? Because I would say that most teams, right, of any real size have some sort of documentation around the risk and controls, right? And that could be in Word documents that are stored in some sort of like SharePoint, or it could be in a GRC system if you're a little bit more advanced, but like that's a requirement, right? Like that's a core fundamental piece. And so the question, I'm assuming the answers aren't that don't indicate that the audience isn't doing this, but rather that doing it is difficult for the reason I mentioned. So if you're managing this in Excel or managing this in document like Word documents, it's very difficult to understand comprehensively what's going on. It's not centralized. So I'm going to take a leap of faith and say that that's probably where that answer comes from. But interesting nonetheless that it's the first one. I would have honestly thought that the understanding the impact of new regulation would have been higher. I feel like, particularly with the advent of AI and all the, like, globally, regulators starting to scramble and like put together and pass different laws and addendums and things of that nature, that that would have been a little bit more pressing. But again 31% doesn't mean it's not an issue either. It's very much an issue, clearly. So yeah, interesting results. And this is why I love doing the polls, right? Because I'm not coming into it with a specific expectation, but it's just great to hear. Thank you, everyone, for participating.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And you're right. The three top answers are pretty close. There's nothing between them, really. But it is interesting. And, like you say, the way that regulations, are changing and evolving. And you've also, if you bring into the question the different regional aspects as well, very much a big challenge, and something that is high on the agenda for organizations, and it needs to be, so yes, definitely some interesting results there. So again, big thank you to everyone for voting on that one. Let's launch our second poll question then whilst we're here. We can leave that one open as we continue our the rest of our discussion. So we want to know, does the rise of AI concern you from a risk perspective? So you've got a few options there. Again, other is down there if you want to go for that one, and if you do, please do feel free to let us know what that other relates to. But I'm going to leave that one open now. Again, really excited to get the findings of that. And AI is such a big conversation at the moment, but we'll come back to that shortly. Okay then, Max. So you've mentioned several instances where you've worked with organizations and they've used process intelligence to help tackle their risk and compliance challenges. Are there any other success stories you can think of that you can share that kind of paint the picture of, in the real world, how organizations could go about doing this and what the real tangible benefits can be?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think to start off, maybe just some metrics that we've seen. I've had customers tell me, look, thanks to using process intelligence, my audits have become 40% faster. Obviously a huge time savings for them. It's also a resource savings because the people on their team can be used for higher level work, because we're taking some of the manual activity out of that, some of the manual analysis out of those engagements. So like 40% reduction in audit times is great. We've seen other customers that try to measure what percentage of the business processes that they have throughout the business are under management, if you will, from a risk and compliance perspective. Like, they've been considered, the challenges have been documented and things like that. And so we have organizations that have documented 3,000 processes within the process intelligence solution. And so they can say, not only from an operational performance standpoint, but also from a risk and compliance standpoint, we have these covered. They're under management, or they're under the purview of the centralized team. Maybe just one end-to-end story, if you will. So we were working with an energy company that was in North America. And this company was particularly concerned with their emergency service requests. So they called this their review to complete process. So because they're an energy company, they handle things like, a pipeline is damaged, a customer has lost heat, there's a gas smell, or like a carbon monoxide indicator has tripped, things like that they need to respond to. And so those emergency services that they offer need to be available 24/7. And they found out that their SLA windows for reacting to these were being violated. And in particular, they categorized, even within the emergencies, there's categorization of like high level and low level emergencies, if you will. I always thought that was a little interesting, because if it's an emergency, it's an emergency in my mind, but these are their words, right? So they have high level and low level emergencies. And they were seeing that for 35% of their high level work orders were non-compliant, and 50% of their low level work orders were non-compliant. And how they figured this out was, like, they knew that they had an issue, right? And that customer satisfaction wasn't great. It was on a downtrend. And so by using process mining, they were able to say, ingest the data in their work order system, basically, and present a view that says, here is the path that the different work orders are taking. And, for 10% of these, they're skipping this step, but this is an important step in the process that's being skipped. Or, 60% of these are passing our internal SLA that we promised to our customers, to respond within however many hours or days, depending on like whatever type of request it is, right? And so they were able to analyze that using process mining, like get that visualization, get that objective data, because if you ask the people who are performing the work orders, they would probably tell you that everything's fine, right? To them, they're just doing their job. But they got this from a data perspective. They were able to model what that process is supposed to look like so that they could then share this with the teams in a more understandable fashion, where they could better explain, here are the different steps that need to be followed. Here's the reasons why. Here's the risks associated with not following them. They were able to retrain their team using that, and then ultimately drastically reduce those violations. Also, I know I've gone back and forth between saying, performance and risk, because the business is more concerned with performance, revenue, productivity, things like that. And the second line of defense is more concerned with making sure that the exposure is limited. By doing this analysis, they also found out that they weren't billing their customers after they had finished the work for 20% of their orders. So not only did they improve this from a risk perspective, where they were able to say we're actually compliant now in the process and getting back to our customers in a meaningful time, and the work orders are following the appropriate steps, they're conformant that way. They were also able to get a huge influx in cash flow because there were these bills that they weren't sending. They were doing the work and they weren't sending the bills. So yeah, that's maybe just like one end-to-end story of how they were using the different facets of process intelligence to de-risk, but also generate value for the business.
Yeah, no, it's really interesting, and again, it shows the value of that, really intrinsic data piece, right? If it's collected in the right way and applied in the right way and analyzed in the right way, what it can show, you could be looking for one thing as your main focus, but it can highlight other areas of business success as well. So thanks for sharing that story, Max. Okay, let's have a look at.
Can I add one thing about that? Actually, now that you say it, and I know I've talked about process mining specifically a lot, and process intelligence, as I've mentioned, is a more complete package, right? But on the process mining point, and that point that you made around sometimes you're looking for one thing and you find another thing, I think that this is one of the real advantages of process mining specifically over other types of analytics tools. If you're using, for instance, like a BI tool, Power BI, Tableau, something like that, it can give you visualizations and give you answers, but you need to know the questions that you want to ask. So you need to be able to say, this is what I want to measure, and then you can write a query to, get you that information. But you need to know what you want to ask. With process mining, it's an exploration, right? Like, sure, you can use it to confirm hypotheses that you have. Like, I think that this is going wrong. Is that actually true? Or you might want to measure it and say, like, how long is this thing taking? But you might see things that you weren't even looking for. It's more exploratory rather than validation, which a lot of other analytics tools, particularly ones when you're looking at analyzing processes, like, it just doesn't work that way. So I think it's a really important point, honestly.
Yeah, great stuff. Thanks, Max. Okay, let's go to one of the other questions we've had come in from Dylan. Let's have a look at this one. So we're working on optimizing processes through automating tasks. I heard there is a way to identify current manual tasks through iGrafx. Can you walk me through how to identify these tasks quickly?
Yeah, so let me answer the general question for the audience, and then I can talk about iGrafx specifically. So typically how that identification, so I've talked about process mining, which is, again, generating that view of the process from the data that exists in the systems. If you have legacy processes or processes that happen in systems that don't really capture a log of their activity, then you can't use process mining. Or if parts of the process are done in a legacy fashion, like they happen through meetings that happen between people, or it happens on paper and not through a system, right? That's something you can't capture with process mining. And there's also desktop activity, things like emailing people, or like sending a Teams message or a Slack message, right? So kind of that group of non-system activity is typically captured through another technology that's part of process intelligence, which is called task mining. And task mining does that examination based on the activity that's happening on a user's desktop, not necessarily what's happening in the backend system. And so doing that, you can get a better view, and combining these is an even better view to understand, what's happening both on system, off system, on desktop, off desktop. I had another thought there, but it just left my head. So for iGrafx specifically, we do not provide task binding directly, but we do work with a partner, KYP.ai, who does task binding that we work with and can help integrate that data. Also, that's from a discovery standpoint. So mining the process to understand what's going on. But certainly from a modeling standpoint, you can capture and document parts of the process that are happening off system. You can show, for instance, here's a document, here's a piece of paper that's sent from this resource to this resource as part of and that could be human to human, human to system, whatever it is. But here's a document that's being transferred that you need to be aware of. So certainly from a documentation standpoint, you can capture all of that.
Okay, great stuff. Thanks, Max. Okay, let's look at the second poll question now. So again, big thank you to everyone for voting on that one. I'm going to close that one off and share the results. So we asked, does the rise of AI concern you from a risk perspective? Again, quite tight on the answers here. Top answer, 29%, was AI is definitely concerning, but isn't a current high priority. That's followed closely by 24% for both, not right now, but it's coming soon, and the risk from AI is overwhelming. They were both tied there. 19%, no, I'm actually using AI to help manage my risk. Fair enough. And just 5% other. Again, if you do want to mention what that other is in the chat, feel free to do so. But so again, quite close, not much in this, Max, but 29% AI is definitely concerning, but it isn't a current high priority. What's your take on that? Is that something you're hearing a lot, or are you surprised?
My first take is that the poll questions are well designed, because sometimes, there's just one answer that's 90% and then nothing else matters. But this is actually, I think this shows like a really interesting diversity of opinion in the audience in terms of what they're dealing with in their individual businesses. And I think in some ways that's scary, but I think in some ways it's also a little bit reassuring that like not everybody feels the same way, or not everybody's path is the same. And so if you're chasing this like golden standard of what you have to deal with, or what you should be thinking of, like that's probably not actually right. There are going to be some businesses that feel like you, that are acting like you right now, and there's some that aren't. So that's just like one general call out for the actual results. I am again a little bit surprised. Like I said, I was just at a risk conference in New York the last 2 days, and they had a stream that was, I forget exactly what it was called, but like the future of technology in risk and compliance, or something like that, right? And like 85-90% of the sessions were talking about AI, like the impact of AI on the business, the how you validate your AI models, make sure that they don't have bias, how you secure your IP so that like, when your marketing team is using ChatGPT to write something, that they're not accidentally feeding data to the provider that could be classified internal information. Like all of these things, like it was pervasive. And I thought it was interesting because there is so much technology that's important as part of the risk and compliance program, but this was like so top of mind. It was a focus. So I will say that it's a little surprising that, the risk of AI being overwhelming isn't higher in my mind. But if you combine that with the AI is concerning, but it isn't a current high priority, then we're over 50%, which I think is, that seems more in line with what I'm hearing in the market when I'm talking to customers.
I think the fact that you've got 19% there actually saying they're actually using it to manage risk is interesting as well, right? There's not much in that, and it's good to know that, we read a lot about the powers of AI and what it can do and stuff, and it's good to see that users are actually using it to help them tackle risk as well. That's kind of that's the point, right? That's what we want AI to do, is to support and augment tasks and things, and make things easier and more efficient for businesses.
It is interesting, and honestly, it's a bit of probably like bad poll design on my part, because that can be true and another answer can be true. You can be using AI to help manage your risk, and you can be overwhelmed by the risk of AI in the business. They're not mutually exclusive. But that is an interesting take, and I have heard a lot about that. Mostly on the legal side of the house is where I've and I'm not going to say that I've talked to like a statistically significant sample set, so this might just be the customers that I've spoken with, but using it for contract review on like the more legal side of the house, looking through old documents where you might have had some paper contracts that are stored in different places. You're bringing those together to get like a combined view of what's actually happening and what the terms are, what the redlining looked like. Yeah, and using AI both for analysis of contracts as well as generation of contracts seemed to be an area where it was being used from an RNC perspective. But I mean, it just makes sense, right? It's going to be everywhere. It's not going away. AI itself has been around for a long time, right? It was already like machine learning was already prevalent to do a whole lot of incredible things. It's really Gen AI that's put all of AI back in the spotlight. And I mean, we're all creators in our jobs. We all do some sort of creation with what we do. It doesn't matter if you're a risk manager or if you're in marketing like I am, right? And so it's not at all surprising that 20% of, at least, because again, it wasn't a perfect poll, 20% at least have jumped on that train and are using it for their own internal risk management.
Yeah. Yeah, great stuff. Thanks, Max. Just look at the time. We've got a few minutes left, so let's look to kind of pull together some takeaways here. And I mean, one question I've still got for you is, what are the most important factors you see for organizations in terms of successfully applying process intelligence? So, I mean, what are the key success factors that businesses need to apply? And also that kind of links to another question I've got, which is about how businesses can enhance their existing process intelligence to take it to another level.
Yeah, so I think that there is a really big people element to this, which is important to be able to get process intelligence into the organization, because you need to get the consensus buy-in and people agree that this is effective. But also on the other end of it, once you have it, I think it helps foster communication in a way that not many other technologies can. And I don't mean communication in like a Teams or like a Slack message. I mean like being able to view process through multiple lenses, but also through this converged perspective where, okay, you can see a process diagram. You can see what the steps are, how they're connected, what the different paths you can follow are, but it's also linked to, here's the corporate strategy and goals. Like, here are the KPIs that hinge on this process. Here are the business services that we offer that rely on this process running. And in the same place, here are the risks associated with the process. Here are the things that could go wrong. Here are the mitigating controls for how we're going to deal with that if that happens. And there's just so much context in the business, this rich context, both from a performance and from a risk standpoint, that I feel like it helps bring people together in how they talk to each other. And because this is an RNC conversation, we're talking mostly about like the different lines of defense, and particularly the first line and the second line and the communication that they have with each other. But I mean, I can't tell you since I've started my career, I've heard people talking about how business and IT don't get along and they don't talk to each other and they don't play nicely together, right? But I think part of the challenge is one that people rarely seem to think like, how are they thinking about this? Like, how can I position this in a way that makes sense to them instead of just telling them what I want, right? So there's a cultural aspect of that. And I feel like they almost talk past each other in that case. And I feel like in some cases, that's what happens with the first and the second line of defense. And so using process intelligence, you can help have a more shared perspective that's more universally accepted. I think to answer the other part of that, like getting it into the organization, you of course want to have buy-in, because there are implications for risk management of the business and performance management. Like, the best thing is to try to not do this in a vacuum, Don't like there are many facets to it, and there's many benefits, and you don't want to say we're just going to take the benefit for our team right here, because the power is really in how it helps you connect to other teams. That being said, after that initial adoption, it might seem hypocritical here, but it's not. I think you do want a wide diversity of people, a consensus to bring it in, but you want to keep that consensus also small in terms of like an overall number of individuals or teams, because what you want to do is you want to get a quick initial win. You want to get something under management. You want to pick a process, a sub process. You want to do something tangible, figure out the ROI that you can get from it using things like simulation and using things like the process mining analysis. And then you want to execute against it and be able to go to other teams or executives and say, look, we did this thing. We had all the success. Like, can we invest more in this? Can we bring more teams on board? Like, can we, like, you start to develop your own hero story as you're championing, the results that you're getting. And so small but diverse team is the short answer for success there in onboarding process intelligence, I'd say.
Cool, great stuff. Well, I think that's probably a great note to look to wrap things up on, Max. Unless anyone's got any dying questions they want to get in the last couple of minutes or so. So I'll leave that open. If you have any questions, now's a chance, because we'll be wrapping up shortly. But just looking forward then, Max, just kind of heading into next year and beyond, what trends you think are going to be really, key in the process intelligence landscape? Obviously, risk is going to be there, but what do you think is going to be, shaping that landscape on an ongoing basis?
It's a great question, and honestly, if I really knew the answer with a lot of certainty, I'd probably work for an analyst and not a software vendor. But my take is, and it just feels like a cop-out saying it, but it's so real you can't ignore it. I mean, it's AI, right? Like, AI is like in its hype heyday. We're seeing what my prediction is that. Let me make this succinct. So if we look at other technology heydays that have happened in the market, right? I'm thinking particularly automation, right? RPA was massive 5 years ago. I think the first Gartner Magic Quadrant came out in 2019 or something like that. And what we saw was, like, it was so hyped up, and like the business value's there, and everyone can just see how doing something automatically rather than having to manually do it is a good thing, right? I would say the Gen AI has a lot of the same promise. Like, that the premise is largely that there's a ton of parallels to automation. But what happened was everybody just kind of grabbed it. They were like, we know we're going to need this to be competitive, so we're just going to throw it at the wall and see what sticks. Like, we're just going to start automating stuff. And, the best case scenario, it was pretty fragmented. Like, different departments weren't using it consistently. Like, IT didn't have control over it. Like, there was technology sprawl that was like unhealthy for the business that later needed to be rectified. But worst case, they were actually making problems worse. If a process was broken, if they didn't understand what value it was driving or what could go wrong with it, and you make that faster, you're throwing gasoline on the fire here, right? And so I think one of those learnings from automation, or one of those growing pains that we saw, was we're going to see that again with AI, where teams are just kind of like I've seen it in organizations. Teams are just saying like different teams are just using ChatGPT, and they're not paying any attention to whether or not their questions are sensitive, whether or not they might be exposing IP. And to some extent, like, once it's out there, it's out there. Like, it's not coming back. Like, yes, there are some remediations, but it's like the internet. Once it's on the internet, it's there. And so I think we're going to see some unfortunate exposure that we didn't want to see. I think we're going to see a lot of people that spent money on this but aren't seeing the ROI I promised, because they didn't really think strategically about like what impact that this had and how it was going to be rolled out and who was going to be involved. And so I think that's going to be a challenge. We're going to kind of like, the hype's going to start to like come down and sit in reality, where yes, there's going to be a lot of success. Like, it's going to change the way that we do business. Like, I'm not saying it's not, but I think that we're going to see but wait a minute, caveat, some nuance around how it's being applied. And I think the reason I'm bringing this up for process intelligence, because you asked, how does this apply to process intelligence, right? Process intelligence answers all those questions about AI when you're deploying it. So what's the value? How does it measure up against the business services? What are the risks involved? How is it in the line of business standard operating procedures? Like all of these questions to contextualize what are we actually doing with AI are solved for with process intelligence. And so I think you can prevent some of that headache by using process intelligence to more effectively deploy AI. And of course, AI is going to become part of the process intelligence stack. Like just like everything else that has a co-pilot, you're going to see that in process intelligence solutions as well. So that's my crystal ball take that may or may not come true.
No, great stuff. Some great points made there, Matt. Appreciate you sharing those. And yeah, I think again, I think that wraps us up very nicely for this conversation. So that really enjoyed having you on board, and obviously a big thank you to iGrafx as well for working with us here at PEX Network to help bring this webinar together. I hope the audience enjoyed it as well. One comment we just had come in is, will there be a recording shared for the session? You'll be able to watch the session back on demand on the PEX Network website from tomorrow. So if you were late to it or missed anything, or if you just want to take it in again, you'll be able to find it. You'll be able to find it there. So one last thank you to our audience for joining us. Hope you had a great time with us. We really enjoyed having you here, and we'll catch you again on the next webinar. So take care of yourselves, and we'll see you again soon. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Michael.